Well, in connection with our theme, I want to talk about living a life of self-giving love. And in the book of Ephesians, chapter 5 and chapter 6, the Apostle Paul talks about being imitators of God, and he challenges us to live this life of self-giving love just as Jesus Christ did. And so I want us to think about that in the context particularly of relationships that begin between husband and wife, parent and child, employer-employees, for it's in the world where we are best known that people ought to believe in us the most. The people that know us the best should believe in us the most. And if our faith isn't good there, it's not good anywhere. And so I want to talk about that in the context of Paul's teaching in Ephesians chapter 5 and 6 particularly. Now, I'm not going to read, it's a lengthy passage, but you see the key verse, "Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love." Now here's the challenge, "just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." What a challenge that is for me and for each of us, to be imitators of God. Now, there are a lot of imitators around. There's imitation vanilla, imitation crab meat, imitation leather. I have noticed as I was researching for this message today that there are an estimated 2,500 Elvis Presley impersonators in the world. People who are trying to imitate Elvis. I don't know if you saw the bumper sticker a few years ago that said, "Honk if you're Elvis." Some of you are old enough to appreciate that. To impersonate somebody or copy or mimic someone else is what we think of as an imitator. And an imitator is usually thought of someone who doesn't like their own identity, so they take on somebody else's identity. Have any of you heard of Bruce Jenner? Or Caitlin? Or Rachel, a civil rights activist in Spokane, Washington, who recently was forced to resign from her job as president of the local NAACP chapter after her parents, who are white, said that she's been imitating African-American lifestyle for many years. Well, Paul is talking here about a different kind of imitation. When he says, "Be imitators of God," he doesn't say, "Be God," but he says, "Be like God," and be like that in your love life. And I don't know if anybody regards you as a saint or anybody regards you as a godly person. There are some people that I have known in Spring Arbor that I would say are godly people. And usually when we say that, we mean that a person is God-like. They have the character of God, and that primary feature is what I would suggest to be self-giving love. And that's what Paul talks about. As dearly loved children, live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Well, God so loved that he did something about it. He didn't just say it, or he didn't just feel like, "Oh, I feel like loving you people." God did something about it. The favorite verse that we all know, John 3:16, said, "God so loved," that he did something about loving. He expressed it in a very tangible way by sending his one and only Son into the world to die for each one of us. And that's what Paul says we should do. We should love just as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. Now, Pastor Mark last week quoted that saying that's in the home for the destitute in Calcutta, India. Do small things with great love. And I think the home is the place where we do that best. Do small things with great love. And I'm suggesting again, if it doesn't work there, it doesn't work anywhere. Living the Christian life isn't private. It's always among others. And sometimes the people that are closest to us we may perceive as being the obstacles to our expression of self-love or of self-giving love. But I want to suggest to you that our walk with Christ and this whole matter of loving as Christ doesn't start for us at least, in Australia or Africa, but it starts in the kitchen, starts in the shop, it starts in the job where we work. Those, again, who know me best should believe in me most. Now, I've heard lots of stories about that. If you could only know what Dad is like at home, or if you could only know what my wife is like on Monday morning when she gets out of bed. If you could only know, I mean, they act this way at church, and I've heard the same about kids at Western School District or Northwest or Concord or whatever school they attend. You know, when they're at church, they're this way, but when they're at school, they're a different kind of person. I want to suggest to you that what the world longs to see most is to see the authenticity of Jesus Christ being expressed in our lives through self-giving love, which means, as Stanley Jones, the missionary to India, used to say, self at the center is always off-center. And we know that we're living in a self-preoccupied world where it's about me and about us and about my rights and what I deserve and what you can do for me. In fact, some even think that worship, we talk about the worship service, is serve us, serve me, come and meet my expectations, when that's just totally the opposite of what Christ is expected of us to do. So if you could just imagine a large concentric circle moving from the inside out, it's the husband-wife relationship, the parent-child relationship, the relationship between employer-employee. As we move out into the world, that's where we make our greatest witness and we're most effective. Now, Paul becomes painfully descriptive about self-giving love in this chapter, because in verses 3 through 7, which I won't read in its entirety, but in verses 3 through 7, he talks about loving, or walking, or living. What are those features of somebody whose life is caught up in being obsessed with themselves, being obsessed with a self-focused and an inward kind of, it's my rights, I am a victim, please serve me, please do something for me kind of mentality. And then in verses 8 through the end of the chapter, and on even into the 6th chapter, he talks about what I would call pro-love walking. Now, I know there are a lot of people that they think the Christian life is primarily about subtraction, spiritual subtraction. And it's the things that I get rid of. And I've had people say, you know, I'm going to come to Christ when I quit smoking, when I quit drinking, when I quit running with the women or the men, when I quit doing this or quit doing that, when I quit doing all these things and get good enough, then I'll come to church, then I'll commit my life to Christ. It doesn't work that way, as you well know. Christianity is not about what we quit doing so much as it is about the things we start doing. And so Paul says there are some definite must-nots, and he identifies those in verses 3 through 7, which is what I call spiritual subtraction. But he focuses primarily on spiritual addition in verses 8 through the early verses of chapter 6. And so I want to talk about, first of all, those must-nots. When he says, but among you, there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's people, God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure: no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of God and of Christ. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore do not be partners with them. So there are some expectations of change that takes place once we have Jesus Christ living his life in and through us, and Paul identifies that. But then in the following verses he says, but you were once darkness, but now you are light, and here are the must-be's. This is spiritual addition. And so he talks about them. And he says, be very careful how you live, not as unwise but wise. Make the most of every opportunity. Understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. And then he identifies, it seems, a kind of a worship experience that takes place in the context of the family. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing and make music in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to the Lord, and in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So how is this self-giving love described? I want to just suggest a few thoughts, and hopefully you'll hang with me here. That's not a good, I guess that's not a good analogy. But anyway, I want you to suggest that it's a love that flows from the love of God, first of all. Self-giving love starts when I fall in love with Jesus Christ, who is the lover of my soul. I will never know the authentic reality of love until I fall in love with Jesus Christ. And I can work on trying to get rid of all those bad things in my life, all the things I want to subtract from my life, all those things I want to get rid of, and it just doesn't work until I fall in love with Jesus Christ. And that's what Paul is suggesting in verses 1 and 2. As dearly loved children, live a life of love, just as Christ loved us. Now our culture says, if you love me, I will love you. And there's a sentimental kind of approach to love. And this goes so much deeper than that. I think of an elderly woman in Madison, Wisconsin, who died several years ago, and I read her story. She had never married. She was a member of Grace Episcopal Church. And in her funeral directions, she requested there be no male pallbearers. Well, they were wondering what it was. She went on to explain. She said, they wouldn't take me out while I was alive, and I don't want them to take me out while I'm dead. Pretty good story, I thought. If you love me, I'll love you. If you don't love me, I'm not going to love you. And so the cultural police in our culture are just obsessed with this whole concept. If you quit loving me, I'm going to quit loving you. But God loves regardless of our situation, regardless of our response to him. While we were still sinners, Christ loved us, Paul said, and gave himself for us. And so divine love loves the unloving and the unlovable, and divine love is always sacrificial love. And that's why Paul says, love as Christ loved. While we were still sinners, Christ loved. So is your love based primarily on feeling, how I feel about you, and if I don't feel that way about you, then I'm no longer going to be in love with you? Or is it based on an intentional act of your will? Now I want to talk with you about a couple of women who made a deep impact on my life and demonstrated for me what self-giving love is all about. She was a member of a little church I served while I was a student at Greenville College. Her husband had left her for a younger woman. She had a very hard and difficult life. But I remember her telling me and Marge this story. And some of you have heard this story before, but it bears repeating because it is one of the best examples I can think of self-giving love. Now here's her husband who deserted her, left her, ran off with another woman, and he became very ill. And after he became very ill, his new wife didn't want to have him as her, she didn't want to be his caregiver. And so she kicked him out of the house. Well, he called this precious woman, I'll just simply call her Emma, and he had the audacity to say, "Can I come back home? I'm sick. The doctor says I'm not going to live. Can I come home?" Now, what do you think Emma would do? He had violated a sacred trust. She could have been filled with all kinds of bitterness. She could have been filled with resentment. But Emma told both Marge and I the story. She took him back home, and she took care of him until he died. And when I think of self-giving love, I think of Emma. I don't know that God required that of her, but she felt that that was the thing she should do. And she took him back and cared for him until he died. That's self-giving love. That's Christ-like love. That's the kind of love that you don't see all that often, it seems. But how refreshing it is when we have those kinds of examples. Emma made an indelible impression upon this young preacher's heart and soul. And any time I've thought of an example of self-giving love, I think of Emma. Emma. And then there was Trula. She was my mother. She had a hard life. 8 boys, 4 girls, impoverished, a husband who was unkind and on occasion violent with her. I remember her crying one day and expressing her sorrow to me. I was just a young boy. When my mother opened her heart with me, she had to talk to somebody, and I was the oldest boy, and she talked with me about it. Many, many years later, just not long before she died, I asked my mother, "Why did you stay with Dad?" And she said, "I did it for you kids." She said, "I didn't want to abandon you kids. I knew that if I left, if I divorced him, if I was separated from him, you kids would have been farmed out into different foster homes." And I know some of you have experienced that, and I sense, I think, a bit of the pain that would be. But when I think of self-giving love, I think of my mother. In a marriage that as I go back and think of it, I don't know that God required her to stay in that marriage, but she did. And I have to honor her today by saying, she, for me, has been an example of self-giving love. Now, some of you are in hard relationships and difficult relationships, and I don't know that God requires that of you. But I do know this, that I believe my friend Jacob DeShazer, who was the Doolittle Raider, who was incarcerated in a Japanese internment camp for 40 months during World War II, told me personally. He said, "Darrell, remember this," as he thought of his own experience, first imprisoned in a terrible situation in Japan for 40 months, almost died, came back, went to Seattle College, prepared himself to go back to Japan as a missionary, and was instrumental in helping Mr. Fuchida, the one who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was influential in helping to lead him to Jesus Christ. It's just an amazing story, amazing story. But this is what he told me. I was pastor at Bedford, Indiana at the time. He said, "Darrell, remember this. Love always wins 100 times out of 100. That's what Paul said in that great love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, when he said, "Love never fails." Sometimes I've thought it's going to fail. I've thought once in a while this is going to be the exception. But Jacob DeShazer's assertion, I think, is biblically correct. Love always wins 100 times out of 100. And so I believe that when he's suggesting, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and he talks about wives, respect and honor your husbands, and he talks about the whole concept of biblical submission, and he talks about parent-child relationships, and even relationships back in that day, as slavery was very much a part of the Roman culture of that time. He talks about those relationships as well. And I believe what Paul is saying is that in the context of these interpersonal relationships, that's where your faith and my faith becomes most viable and where it becomes most authentic. For it's so easy in our culture to just let those things slip into oblivion and believe that love is not going to win. I like the statement of Mother Teresa as well. As she worked with the orphans of Calcutta, someone asked her one day what motivated her to minister to the dirty and the diseased of Calcutta. And she responded, "I see them as Jesus in disguise. For Jesus said, 'Inasmuch as you've done it unto one of the least of these, my brothers or my sisters, you've done it unto me.'" Jesus in disguise. How many of us, any one of us we would do anything for Jesus. But for my wife who's obnoxious, or my husband who's nasty, or walks in the house on the carpet with his boots covered with mud, or a father who seems unreasonable, or a mother who loses her voice and becomes hysterical almost in the way she treats me. How am I going to respond in those kinds of situations? And I just challenge you to say, we are to live a life of love just as Christ loved and gave himself for us. Now, I've got more message here than I've got time. But Paul is very specific about this. In fact, embarrassingly so, when he talks about this in anti-love kinds of language in verse 6, when he's talking about all these descriptors of things that are not like self-giving love. And he says it's because of these things that God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. If I accept God's love, I'll begin to imitate him. I'll long to be like him, and whatever offends God also offends me. So this passage underscores a side of God's holiness that we tend to ignore, that those who live immoral, impure lives can expect God's wrath. And so he's very embarrassingly specific when he says, but among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality, impurity, greed, and all those things. That's tough truth. And in our day, what is sexual immorality? It's sexual intimacy that violates God's will. It's anti-love. It's self-focused love. It's self-fulfilling love. It's not self-sacrificing or self-giving love. God isn't opposed to sex. In fact, the first sexual thought was in the mind of the Creator, not in the created. God invented it. And the vision, the Creator's vision, was given in Genesis 1 and 2. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. A man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Jesus reaffirmed that creation vision in Matthew 19. And the biblical teaching is very, very clear and very concise and hard to misunderstand, that any sexual relationship with a person outside of a monogamous heterosexual marriage is sexual immorality. And it's an offense to a holy God. And you know, it really doesn't make any difference what a bishop says, or the Supreme Court justice says, or a judge may say about that, or even a pastor. The Bible isn't fuzzy or ambiguous about God's creation vision for marriage and for family. That's why Satan knows that if he can destroy the family, he can destroy the impact of Christians in a culture like ours. And so he does a frontal attack on families. And that's why I believe we witness best when we stay true and faithful and stay in covenant with one another in family relationships and in parent-child relationships and brother-sister relationships. We must do that to protect the witness of Jesus Christ in a world like ours. Anybody say amen? Any of you know Russell Wilson, quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks? Do you know last Sunday, Russell Wilson sat down for an interview with his pastor, Miles McPherson, of San Diego's Rock Church. And he spoke with the pastor about his relationship with pop star, I think it's Kiara, saying, in our relationship, we are doing it Jesus' way. In other words, they are not doing it. They are committed to sexual abstinence until they get married. And it was interesting to me to read some of the response of the people who were commenting on that in the news media. I read where one person called it painfully sounding. Another who called it nonsensical. I thought, that's our culture. That America is in a modern retelling of the Old Testament book of Judges, where everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. And Paul takes issue with that and says that God's wrath abides on those who live in those kinds of anti-love, self-focused relationships. In fact, he talks about greed and talks about the greedy person as someone who doesn't find fulfillment in the Creator, so they look for it in the created, and people are doing that all over in our culture. The greedy person says, God, I don't find you able to meet my needs. You aren't all you say you are. Thanks for all the stuff you gave me, but now get out of my way so I can live my own life. I no longer need to worship you. I'm going to worship what you made. The Rolling Stones song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Any of you old enough to remember that one? It's descriptive of a futile search for contentment and meaning in life. And during those days, there was the arrival of no-fault divorce and legal abortion, which is fault-filled, I would say, legal abortion. sabotages the search for meaning. I can't get no satisfaction. And it's the description of a life where people are chasing after the wind, looking in all the wrong places for the answers. And so Paul says, we live as children of light. We were once darkness, but now we're light in the Lord. Live as children of the light, not in a dream world constructed on a false fantasy, but openness and truth. And so he says, have nothing to do, verses 12 to 14, with the fruitless deeds of the darkness, but rather expose them, for it is the light that makes everything visible. Stuart Briscoe, a pastor friend of mine, now retired pastor of the Elmbrook Church up in Waukesha, Wisconsin, once told a story when he was a young man. He was working for a bank. And the banker said, if a certain customer calls, you tell him I'm not here. And Stuart looked him in the eye, and this is what he said. He said, you know, if I lie for you, I'll also lie to you, and I'm not going to do that. Well, he kept his job. But I thought that. We are people of the truth. We live according to God's will. We are not foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. We live as children of the light. This is so wonderful that the facts are, they're just stubborn. The truth just is. And how wonderful it is for that to be true. I remember President Lincoln's story, if I call a tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have? Well, if you answered 5, he would say, wrong, 4. Just because I call a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. But that's the problem with our culture today. And so Paul says, we're not foolish, but we understand the Lord's will. And we don't say, Lord, this looks like this is inconvenient for me. And here's what I suggest you do. It's time for me to help you out. Ever feel that way with God? We understand God's will. We know our vulnerabilities. We know the trigger points. We avoid them. And we understand God's will and embrace it. Stop doing stupid stuff. Now, I'd better start editing. I want to talk, just let me close just by talking a little bit about submission, because one of the big things in chapter 5 is this whole idea of submission to one another out of reverence for Christ. He doesn't say just wives submit to one another, to your husband, but he says submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And there is a mutual submission that is an indicator, I believe, of self-giving love. Any of you ever feel bullheaded? Any of you ever stubborn? Any of you ever want your way? And I don't care what you think? Well, this is anti-love living. And so self-giving love becomes the most authentic witness, and probably the best indicator of that is mutual submission. We're not dynamic doormats, but we do recognize God-appointed authority in the home, in the community, and in the place of employment, and that's where we witness best to self-giving love. I thought of Tim and Penny Davidson and Todd and Faith Holton as I was preparing this message, and I thought of the response of this church to those two families during their time of crisis. And I thought, that's self-giving love. Here's a first-hand example. As we're being shaped and formed as lovers into a life of caring and giving and sharing, romance is there, but it's more than that. It's a life of intentional self-giving love. Be imitators of God as dearly loved children, and live a life of love just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering. Now, you've got a response form either in your pew or you've got it in your hand in your worship folder. And this is what I'd like to suggest we do. Is there anybody here who's in a challenging relationship with their husband? I don't want you to raise your hand. Did I see you do that, Cindy? You didn't raise your hand, did I? Is there anybody here in a challenging relationship with your husband or wife? Is there anybody here who's got trouble with your father or your mother or a brother or a sister? Is there anybody here who can just hardly stand it when you go to work tomorrow because of the employer you've got? or because of an employee that's making things absolutely horrendous for you? Is there anybody here who's got a neighbor? Oh, I've had them. Don't now, but I have, in the past years, yes, I could tell you stories. A neighbor. On that response card, if there is a challenging interpersonal relationship going on with you right now, would you just identify that in a sentence or two on that response card right now? Anybody got a response card? You know what I'm talking about? Charlie, there it is right there. Charlie, there's a pencil right here. Okay? You've all got one, right? Or you got one on the pew rack. It's right there. And if you've got a relationship that you'd like this morning to say, Jesus, I can't live this life of self-giving. I can't love as Christ loved. It's just tough. It's hard. It's difficult, and I can't do it. But this morning, I'd like to make a covenant with you. I'd like to renew my covenant. I'd like to, in a new way, if I can't love this person, I want you to love that person through me. Jesus, would you love that person through me? Just as Christ loved. That's what I want. I want to be an imitator of God, and I want your kind of self-giving, redemptive love to flow through me. Because you see, folks, if we can't do it, it just isn't going to work anywhere. And if you can't do it at home in your relationship with your husband, your wife, your kids, or whatever, parents, it's not going to work anywhere else. And so I'm going to challenge you to identify that on that response card. And here's what I'd like you to do. And in just a few moments, Kent and Candy are going to help us sing. And when they do that, I'd like for you, we'll be standing then, and I'd like for you just to come and place that card on the altar. And say, Jesus, I've tried, and it doesn't work. I know. You know the story of me and my dad. I wish I had time. I can't rehearse that again. But I know from personal experience that God can redeem relationships that are fragmented and broken if we're committed to self-giving love, if we're committed to loving as Christ loved us. And so I would invite you to come and place it on the altar as a refreshed and renewed covenant on your part for Christ to work through you in new and redemptive ways. Now, is that clear, Charlie? You got that. Now, I know I can pick on Charlie. But I don't want to pick on this guy behind you because he's a whole lot bigger than I am. How are you, Chuck?
Doing all right, Pastor.
Good to see you.
Thanks.
All right, you got the instructions right? Anybody who doesn't know, I can try to clarify. Let's stand together. Kent and Candy, are you there? Yeah. Would you sing, and as you sing, would you come and place those cards on this altar, not in kind of showmanship, but as an act of devotion and covenant with the Lord you love and serve? He loved you first, and you're asking him to let his love flow through you in terms of some of these fragmented relationships. Feel free to come and just place those on the altar. Okay.